Thanks, Chad, for having me out here. I live in New Braunfels, and I'm a member of the New Braunfels chapter, but also this chapter. Recently joined this last year, and I've done a few talks for those folks, and I think I've been out here.
Last July?
Yeah,
June maybe?
sometime last year to talk to you guys, and once to talk to the master naturalists, and so I enjoy coming out and giving talks. Today I'm going to talk about drought, which is something that's probably you guys have some experience with, maybe. Yeah. Yeah, I say we've lived through the last couple of years of pretty just horrendous drought, and it really drives home a lot of, I think for a lot of people, it takes a good crisis to kind of change their mind on things. And so we don't want to waste a good crisis now that we've got one. So let's try to learn some lessons from it that we can take forward. Before I start, I'm going to say I've been learning about plants and thinking about plants, and for over 20 years, since back when I was in school as an undergrad. And until just a couple of years ago, I never really learned how plants actually work, like physiologically, and how soil works. And so that was, as I've started to learn more about soil and soil health, and soil microorganisms and how they interact with plants, it's really kind of been a game shift for me in the way that I look at plants. And so today I'm talking to a group of plant folks, mostly about soil, and then we'll talk about some plants toward the end. But when we talk about drought, I think of like two different distinct types of drought. So we have this kind of shorter term drought, which I call soil drought. So last year's a good example of this. We had a decent bit of rain kind of mid-spring, and then it just like quit raining, like the tap just turned off, and within 45, 60 days, everything was just completely bone dry. And so that's the kind of drought that happens here very frequently. It's short onset, and it affects the soil moisture. So if you're thinking about the drought that a plant has to live through, this is something they go through all the time. There's also longer onset drought. So these kind of longer cycles of drought that we also see that are over multiple years. I'm worried that we're kind of in the third year of what may be a longer term, longer onset drought. And these droughts are not just detrimental to soil moisture, but they also affect our water table. So I think of this as more like the water table drought, aquifer drought. I was out this past weekend. We went to go try to do some fishing with my son on the Guadalupe River above Canyon Lake, and hadn't been up there in over a year. And we got to the spot where we had fished before, and there was no water in the Guadalupe River. There were little pools here and there, but the main channel was empty. There was no flow. And so that's an example of this longer onset drought. And so it's helpful to think about when you mention drought, it's not just one phenomenon. The other thing that's important to realize is that drought is natural. We live in a part of the world where drought is a natural recurring thing, and it happens on these natural cycles. If you want to look back at the kind of the period of time that we live in for the last 14,000 years, called the Holocene, we've had kind of the current climate and weather that we have here in Central Texas during that time. But there've been really big droughts that have occurred all throughout that time. And the plants that are here today that have survived and made it through, those are the ones that can handle the type of drought that we have here. So our native plants are resilient to drought, and our ecosystems are resilient to the type of drought. But one thing that we're realizing is that the climate that we had for the last 14,000 years is maybe not the climate that we have today and tomorrow and going into the near future. And so we have to start thinking about, are there things we're doing now that are making drought worse, and how are they making it worse? There we go. So most folks have heard about climate change that's come from CO2 emissions from coal and natural gas and oil. And if you look at like a graph here of since the 1850s to the early 2000s, kind of the relative contribution of all these things to this kind of increase in CO2, you see that coal and oil and gas are are really big on there. But the one thing that most folks don't realize is that soil, which here what we have called land use, is mostly CO2 emissions that come from soil. And so historically, there was a lot of soil tied up in the soil, or a lot of carbon tied up in the soil in the form of organic matter and humus that was stored there for decades or hundreds of years. And because of land use practices in Central Texas, starting in 1850s or so, we start to see that carbon come out of the soil. And so how that happens by when we till the soil, it breaks it up and it introduces oxygen to that stored carbon, and it releases it as CO2. Bacteria eat that carbon and release it. When we add inorganic fertilizers, particularly nitrogen, into the soil, we speed up that process, and we give those bacteria food to munch on that carbon faster and exhale it out into the air. And so you see kind of a spike in those emissions around the 1950s, whenever we started really using inorganic fertilizers on kind of a massive industrial scale. Yes.
So is the melting of the tundra, or there's an awful lot of CO2 up there, that's not really in this yet? Or is it just?
We're going to see, I don't know where they would include that in terms of this graph where we're looking at human caused CO2 emissions. But that's something that's happening as a byproduct of all of this. That's also kind of another positive feedback loop that's releasing a lot of that stored carbon that was in permafrost, that was frozen soil.
In blue.
So it's not even in that, yeah. And so those CO2 emissions that come from soil are really important. The other thing that we see is that affects drought and makes drought worse here is that we're reducing the soil's ability to hold organic matter so that it gets converted to CO2. We're decreasing infiltration and water holding capacity. So all of that carbon that's in the soil that's locked up as humus and other complex carbon compounds, it acts as a sponge and holds on to water and allows more water to infiltrate. And so if we're reducing that in the soil, we're also decreasing the ability of the soil to retain water and nutrients. You can see the soils here. You can see the one on the left here is this nice black chocolate cakey looking soil. It's got a lot of carbon in that, a lot of organic matter. And then this is a more depleted soil. This is a lot what you typically more see in the hill country or the Blacklands. This kind of grayish, crumbly, hard soil that doesn't have all of that black organic matter anymore. And then the last thing that happens whenever we degrade the soil down to the point where it will no longer infiltrate very much water, when we do get a big rain, that water comes and it pools on the surface, and then it washes away the soil that's there. And so then you just end up with just spare mineral subsoil below. So we're doing a lot of things that kind of act as negative feedback loops and make the whole situation worse when we do have a drought because we have less resiliency to it. So we need to think about what did Central Texas soils look like before we impacted them. In the hill country where we are here, the soils are typically kind of shallow, rocky soils. We have a lot of slopes, and so you don't get these really deep, 4, 5, 6 foot thick soils. Most of our soils are fairly shallow, and you have a lot of rock in them. But there also can be very high in organic matter. So if you got on here one of these wooded hillsides, there can be, several inches of just like decomposing leaves and cedar duff. And that breaks down to form a really rich organic soil that can hold a lot of carbon. As we've degraded those areas, once that stuff washes off, you're down to just bare mineral caliche, and it won't infiltrate water at all. If you go down to the bottomlands, down off the slopes, there are deep clay loams, and you can get those deep kind of clay grassland soils like you see in the Blacklands. When we look at the Blackland soil, so go to New Braunfels and east of I-35, we had these deep clay soils that were just extremely, extremely rich in organic matter. They could hold more organic matter than really any other type of soil. And these were some of the richest, most fertile soils on the planet. They were really amazing. When they got that way is for the last several thousand years, we've had tall grass prairie growing on those, and the roots from those prairie plants grow several feet down into the soils. And you think about all those roots every year that die and slough off, and you've got new carbon, new organic material being introduced at 6, 8, 10 feet depth down into the soil year on year on year. And so they're just these really amazing soils, extremely high in organic matter, and they can hold massive amounts of water. They're giant black sponges. So what's happening? This is kind of the depressing part of the talk too, I'll have to say. Before anybody gets too discouraged, it does sort of pick up in the middle here, and we'll start to go back uphill. What's happening? One of the problems when you have an issue, when you have degradation, and it occurs over multiple generations, it's often hard for people to see how good things used to be and how bad they've gotten. They can really there's this shifting baseline where they really only see what's happened in their generation. So I'll give an example of that. I have a friend who told me a story about a rancher that he talked to out in Edwards County, out in the western part of the hill country. And this rancher, he said that he was so proud because his granddaddy raised the best beef cattle in all of Edwards County. And then his daddy raised the best sheep in all of Edwards County as well. And he was pretty proud that he had the best goats in Edwards County. And so you start to think about it, and what are his kids going to have? They're just going to have rocks, because that's basically all that's going to be left. But he doesn't see that. He just sees what's happening in his lifetime. And so when we look at it, the soil degradation on the landscape, in the change in the plant communities, we don't see what's happened for the last 150 to 200 years. We just kind of see what's happened in our time here. An example, so you go out and you drive the highways, and I work for TxDOT, so I'm on the highways a lot, and you see these just fields and fields and fields, miles and miles of just nothing but bluebonnets. And everybody I love bluebonnets. Bluebonnets are a great plant. But bluebonnets are a colonizer plant, and their role is to come in when there's bare mineral soil that has no organic material, that has no nutrition, and they come in and they're kind of that first plant that comes in and colonizes the moonscape. And it starts to bring nitrogen, it starts to put fertility back in. And so when you have an area that has bluebonnets on it and really nothing else growing on it for year after year after year, what that's really telling you, and what I see when I see that, is that's an area that's got really depleted, degraded soil that's not improving very much. And it may take years and years and years and years for it to get back to anything approaching what it used to be. So not to bum you too much about bluebonnets.
Is this the happy part?
We're getting there. Almost there. So what you see out here on the landscape around us is we've had a loss of organic matter. That's a lot of it's come from tillage and fertilization. So when we till the soils, when we fertilize the soils, we're releasing that CO2, so we're losing our carbon that way. And then a lot of it has come from when we overgraze areas and we don't leave enough plant cover on. When we get big rains, it washes away. So it's that combination of losing the carbon through degradation, and then the soil washing away. That leads to a loss in soil in infiltration in the soil, which makes this erosion problem even worse. And so it's kind of this vicious cycle of the worse the soil gets, the less water it can hold, the more it washes away. And so how do we kind of get past this? And so this is where the depressing part gets. So in order to understand how we can improve our soil, we need to understand what healthy soil is and how it gets that way. Healthy soil has a mind-boggling amount of biodiversity in it. You can have in like a square meter of soil, you can have trillions of bacteria, and you can have tens of thousands of little microarthropods, insects and mites, earthworms. It's this vast, huge soil community. And if you think about like soil food webs, you've heard about food webs. You know, they have all the producers at the bottom, and you kind of move your way up. If you're looking at a good, healthy soil, it's going to have all of this diversity in bacteria and fungi and protozoans and nematodes. And as you move up and move up and move up, you're going to have up towards the top, then you're going to have these big, large things that we can see, like earthworms and mites and spiders. If your soil doesn't have a lot of these things up at the top, it probably doesn't have a very good base. But as you improve your soil and as you get more and more diversity and more life of bacteria and fungi and protozoans and nematodes, what will happen is you'll increase the ability of your soil to support life of all these other things at the top, all the way up to birds. And if you have a garden, people. The other thing to realize is that soil should have a healthy balance between fungi and bacteria. In our culture, we kind of like have this like phobia of fungi, but fungi are really extremely important in soil health. And a healthy soil will have a good balance of fungi and bacteria, whereas a really degraded soil will mostly just have bacteria, if anything. And then a healthy soil is like a city. It's got a structure. It's got like, you know, buildings and houses and streets. And most of that structure is built by fungi. So they're most of the fungal bodies are not the actual like mushrooms and things we see. They're these hyphae, these little threads that go all throughout the soil and kind of stitch everything together, hold the soil together. They create pores and spaces in the soil where water can go through. They convert carbon to more stable forms. So they take things like cellulose and lignin that are in the soil from the breakdown of plants, and they convert those into forms of carbon that will stay in the soil for a really long time and that will hold on to water. Another really cool thing that fungi do is they will scavenge minerals. So if you have a soil that doesn't have a lot of, say, phosphorus in it, but the bedrock down below the soil has phosphorus in it, they can actually go down with their hyphae, and then they have organic acids that will dissolve the rock, and then they can take up that phosphorus, other minerals, and then they can move that around through the network and share it with others. And they do the same thing with water. And so fungi are really critical.
Are they what break down the leaves and other organic matter coming down from the trees?
Yeah, almost most of that breakdown of leaves and up to wood is done by fungi. There are some types of bacteria that will break down cellulose, but most of the cellulose and the lignin, those really tough carbohydrates that won't break down, they're really stable. It takes fungi to do most of that. So I told you that I studied plants for 20-something years, and I never really learned how plants work. So we're going to talk about how plants work. A good analogy for thinking about how plants actually work is to think of them as lichens. So you guys know lichens are they're kind of this weird composite organism that's not just one species, right? It's one or more species of fungi that act as kind of the body, and then you have one or more species of usually algae, but sometimes blue-green bacteria that are photosynthetic that live in the body of the fungi, and they kind of just form this one kind of super organism that you know, the algae takes sunlight and converts it to food, to sugars, and feeds that to the fungi, and then the fungi provides you know, kind of shelter for the algae, keeps it safe, provides like stable moisture conditions, and it breaks down rock and provides mineral nutrients that the algae needs. Well, those were basically the first plants that occurred on land, were these lichens. You go all the way back into, you know, when Earth was first kind of being colonized by life, and that same relationship still basically exists. So plants partner with fungi called mycorrhizal fungi that grow in association with their roots or even grow into their roots inside the plant. And The fungi go out and they scavenge and help get plants get water. They break down rocks and bring that up to the plants. And they even will help plants share back and forth with other plants. What happens is that plants will produce, they produce all this energy. And just like the algae in a lichen, they'll give some of that energy to the fungi. So the plants will take up to 20 or 25% of all of the sugar that they produce, all of the energy they produce, and they'll pump that down into their roots and then out into the soil, into this area around the roots called the rhizosphere. And they feed it. It's like a partnership. They trade sugar, all the other things that they need that they can't easily get on the ground. And I thought plants like, you just put them in dirt and then you add water and you add all, if they need nitrogen, you add nitrogen. If they need phosphorus, you add phosphorus. But, really, they figured this out millions and millions of years ago and they don't really need our help. So that was kind of a mind shift for me was, plants and fungi already know how to take care of each other. And so they don't really need us to do all of these things for them. They mostly just need us to get out of their way. Other things that these mycorrhizal fungi do, a lot of this is just really cutting edge research that we're learning more and more every month. Like if you get scientific journals, new crazy things are coming out all the time about mycorrhizal fungi. There's some of them that get in plants when they can actually, when a plant is being attacked by an insect or a pathogen, they can actually get in and switch on genes in the plant's genome that help produce chemicals to stop the attack. And so they're really in sync way more than we think. And it's pretty crazy stuff. One of the coolest things though about these mycorrhizal networks is because they go all throughout the soil and they connect up the plants, a lot of times they'll connect one fungi will connect between several different types of plants. And you might have a plant like a legume that is able to, produce nitrogen from the bacteria that live in its roots, those little nodules. And so it has kind of more nitrogen than it needs. And then you might have another plant that has, that's better at getting phosphorus from the soil or cadmium or copper or some other mineral. And the fungi will actually help the plants trade between them. And so it's like this little market economy underground where their plants are trading back and forth and the fungi are kind of the middleman making it all happen. So you can't understate how important fungi are. Okay, so step one, we're going to improve our soil. First thing we need to do is we need to see what we have. We need to assess the conditions that we have. And most people would just say, okay, well, you need to go buy a soil kit, and then you go and you take some soil, put it in a jar, you send it off to some soil scientist. They're going to pour a bunch of acid on it, dissolve it all, and then tell you what comes back. Well, that's, you can do that, and that will tell you some things about your soil, but that's not the only way to find out about your soil, and it's not the easiest way. So what I advocate is that you can use your senses to learn a lot about the soil that you have. So your site, look at the soil, take a sharpshooter, dig a little soil pit, down till you get to the subsoil and look at it. What color is it? Is it this nice, dark black? That's going to tell you it's got a lot more organic carbon in there. Is it that light gray where all the carbon has come out of the soil and you're just down to the minerals? Or is it just white caliche? It should be nice and kind of crumbly. It shouldn't be blocky. It shouldn't be just really, really hard. You can feel it. You can smell it. So healthy soil should smell good. It shouldn't smell like chemicals. It shouldn't smell like rotten eggs. It should have that kind of earthy, everybody kind of knows that earthy smell that you get like after a rain. That's what it should smell like. And it should have a smell, because if your soil has no smell, that tells you there's not a lot of life in there and there's not a lot of carbon in there. Some people even advocate for tasting the soil. I would say if you've got a healthy soil, tasting it is probably, I don't know that it would taste good, but it wouldn't taste bad. You can do a simple infiltration test. So you get on the internet and find kind of the directions for doing this, but you could do something as simple as taking a coffee can, take the bottom off of it, pound it into the ground, make some marks on it, and you can pour water in and then measure the amount of time it takes for it to take, an inch of water. How long does it take to take that first inch? Add some more water. How long does it take to take the second inch, the third inch? And you can measure over time as you improve your soil. You'll see how you go from not very much infiltration where that water just ponds and sits there to just soaking it up almost instantly. So a good healthy soil will just absorb water and absorb water and absorb water. Even organic matter. So you can do a simple organic matter test where you take an amount of soil, dry it out, you weigh it, you put it in the oven and basically cook all of the carbon out of it and convert that to CO2. And then you weigh it again and you can measure like percentage of carbon was in there that was lost. So there's a lot of things that you can do yourself that you don't need a soil test or a soil scientist to tell you. And now that you've assessed your soil, you got to come up with goals. What are our goals for how we're going to improve? And so I would say if you're only going to have kind of one goal, one thing that you're shooting for, the best thing to shoot for is to add soil biodiversity. Because if you can get a biodiverse soil that has a lot of bacteria, a lot of fungi, a lot of nematodes, a lot of springtails, mites, and it's gonna have all of these other properties as well. So biodiversity is really the key in your soil. Also, you do want to increase soil organic matter. We've talked about how important soil organic matter is in grabbing and holding water, and also into holding on to carbon so that it's not released into the atmosphere. You want to improve your infiltration rate. If you look at a good soil that's got good healthy structure, it's got lots of little, they call them like soil aggregates, where the fungi have kind of pulled the soil together in these little particles that leave little channels and things. This soil's got good structure and it's gonna infiltrate really well. Versus a more hard, compacted soil where all of that stuff is kind of pressed together and water really can't get through. So we want to improve infiltration rate. And what that will do is it will improve water holding capacity. So it'll allow more water to soak in and then be held there and be used over, like, if we get a bunch of rain in the spring, by June or July, if you have a lot of water soak in and be held there, those plants are still going to have access to that water. Versus if we only have water held in the top couple of inches, that's going to be gone pretty quick, right? And then ultimately, it'll also help us reduce soil erosion. So we talked about how as you lose infiltration capacity and water holding capacity, that water sits on the surface and then it starts to wash the soil away. Currently take action. So I've been doing a lot of reading the last few years about kind of the soil health movement and regenerative agriculture. And a lot of this comes out of that kind of agricultural movement to improve soil health. But you can take the same basic tenets of soil health from agriculture and you can apply them to anything you're doing, growing plants or trying to improve soil, whether it's in your garden at home, whether it's in your flower beds, whether it's your lawn. But the kind of the four basic principles of soil health are minimize soil disturbance. So that's both physical disturbance and chemical disturbance. So try to avoid tilling up areas if you can. When you go to plant things, obviously you're going to have to dig a hole to put something in, but try to minimize the amount of area that you're digging up and tilling up, because what you're doing is all those little fungal hyphae that go all through the soil. You're breaking those networks every time you go in and till things up and bust things up. And so then they have to regrow and that takes time. So you're kind of setting the soil back every time you do that. All of the sides that we like to add, fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, all of those things that we add on, they have effects on things that we don't intend for them to affect. A lot of the herbicides actually are damaging to soil fungi as well. And so when you're putting this on to kill a weed, but then you're also destroying all of the beneficial fungi that are there that are helping the plants that you want. So you're taking that soil and you're setting it back. And you're starting it over. Okay. The second principle is to keep the soil covered with some sort of plant material. You can use, wood mulch, or just, whenever you go and have like grass thatch, things like that, hay, straw. having some sort of cover over the soil will help hold moisture in. When it gets dry, you probably all experience this. You have the landscape areas and you put mulch on them because it helps hold that soil moisture in. And it also helps protect against erosion. So when you have raindrops fall, they have a lot of energy. And if they're hitting mulch, they're not breaking up that soil surface and washing it away. So they will provide some armoring and some protection for that soil surface. So keeping it covered is really important. The other thing that a lot of people kind of neglect is that you want to keep living roots in the soil at all times. So I live in New Braunfels and I go, driving out around the Blacklands in the wintertime, and it kind of breaks my heart because I'm driving out there and I see all of this black soil that, they grow corn or whatever they're growing out there, but they only grow it for, a few months of the year, and the rest of the year they just till it up and leave it just sitting there. And so there are no living roots in that soil. And we talked about how plants are, their job is to take all this energy and pump it down into the soil and feed all of the soil life. So if you only have plants there for 3 or 4 months out of the year, all those things that are there growing with the roots are going to starve to death, and they're not going to be able to be there the next year when they need them. And so we want to have living roots in the soil at all times. We want to have plants that are actively photosynthesizing all the time. We're kind of lucky that we live in Central Texas where it's warm enough all year long for plants to be growing. So we don't really have this like part of the year where everything is dead and frozen. In this part of Texas, we can grow warm season plants during the warm season, and we can grow cool season plants during the cool season. And we can always have some sort of plant that's living and growing in the soil. And that's gonna improve the amount of nutrition that's going into the soil and feeding all those soil organisms. And I practice this in my own little garden beds in my backyard. So I try to make sure that I have lots of cool season vegetables going in the winter, even if it's stuff that I'm not necessarily going to eat a lot of. It's providing food for all those organisms in my garden. I have barley right now that's growing in there as kind of a cover crop. And I'm probably not going to take that barley and mill it and make bread out of it, but it's providing cover and it's providing food for all those soil organisms right now in my garden. And then the other thing that we want to keep in mind, that kind of the fourth tenet here, is plant diversity. You want to have a diversity of root types. So you think about like grasses that have really bunchy fibrous roots, sunflowers that might have really deep roots, other plants may have kind of more branchy roots, and how all those can kind of fit together and occupy that soil space more efficiently. The other thing I like to tell people is don't skimp on the grasses. When people do landscape areas and they're trying to make it showy and ornamental and pretty, they just want to put a bunch of like flowery things in there, and grasses are just kind of like an afterthought. Maybe you have a few here and there to take up space. But we live in a grassland biome. Grasses are one of the kind of the dominant species that occur in this area, and there's a huge diversity of them. And so you want all of your planted areas, you want to make sure you're incorporating that diversity of grasses, and that you have both cool season and warm season grasses, because that's going to keep that soil healthy all throughout the year. And also throw in sedges here. You guys know a lot about sedges. They kind of look like grasses, but they have edges. And so most people think of sedges as just sort of like wetland plants for like water gardens, but there actually are a lot of sedges that grow. There's a handful of sedges that grow really well here, and they have a really beneficial, can be really drought tolerant as well. And overall, if you have a lot of plant diversity, these plants are all going to kind of support each other. We talked about how plants have different nutritional needs, and they'll trade back and forth with each other. And so a diverse plant community is going to be a healthier plant community than a monoculture. So taking action. The other thing that we want to make sure we're doing is that when we do get rain, that we're catching and holding onto it. So most of our built infrastructure, our roadway systems, our neighborhoods are designed to shed water. We even talk about the place we live as we live in the Guadalupe watershed. So we live in an area that we have designed to shed all the water off and shunt it to the Guadalupe River so it can carry it away to the ocean. And then we complain when it's really dry and there's no water around. So what we need to do is we need to change our mindset from having a watershed mindset to a water catchment mindset. We want to catch that water and hold on to it so that we have it available. How can you do that on your scale? You guys have heard of rain gardens? So rain gardens they don't have to be complicated. There's a lot of information on the internet about how you can build a rain garden, but it's basically just a low spot that you build a berm around that you can capture kind of runoff coming off of your roof or some other more kind of impervious area and infiltrate it down into some loose soil and have some plants growing in it that can utilize that. It could be as simple as that. You can do simple things like terracing on slopes, taking some landscape timbers or some decorative rock and kind of building little check dams down a slope if you've got a sloped area, and then backfill it behind that with compost and rich soil and plant into it. And that will catch that water as it's coming down the slope and allow it to infiltrate and go down and hold onto it. Mulch and compost are really great. Talked about the 3 C's of people like any of the 3 C's: compost, compost, and more compost. Mulch and compost are great for not only providing like structure for the soil, because you have all of that like decaying cellulose and lignin and all those carbohydrates that provide kind of structure and pore space in the soil, but they also provide food for your soil organisms. Like those fungi will eat that wood material as it continues to decay and decay and decay over years. And when you add, especially when you add compost, you're also bringing in new soil organisms to your soil. The one thing I would say about mulch and compost is that they're, as inputs, they're kind of expensive. So if you've got a huge area, say you've got a couple of acres and you're wanting to improve all of your soil, it's going to be difficult to bring in enough compost and enough mulch to do it all at once, to do it all in a year. So what I would say is kind of pick some priority areas, some core areas to focus on, and try to get those as good and as rich and as healthy as you can, and increase your soil biodiversity in those areas. And that's where you would focus your inputs that cost a little more. And then over time, what will happen as you improve all the other areas, those soil fungi will spread out from those areas, and eventually they'll kind of all grow together and you'll have one big healthy ecosystem. Yes.
Diversity of sources for compost. I mean, what are some examples, like maybe a mushroom or leaf mold?
Yeah, I would say, if you've got some space, make your own compost, and you can make it out of. It's best to have a diversity of sources. So compost that's made from straw and manure is going to have different properties and different microorganisms living in it that a mushroom compost is going to have. So the more different sources of materials that go into it that you have, the more biodiversity you're going to get out too. If you have access to like different types of animal manures, those all come with their own little colonies of different types of beneficial bacteria. And so, having a diversity of compost is going to increase soil diversity as well. And then if you've got large areas that you can't focus on all at once, there's a lot of plants that are these kind of more weedier species that you can bring in, and seed is fairly cheap. You can seed those areas. Actually, I say seed is cheap. Seed is actually free. Did you know this, guys, that like you can go out on the side of the road and like collect seed and then come back and use that? I do that a lot. And so that's a really good way for those areas that you can't focus as much of your inputs on. You can allow those plants, those kind of weedier plants, to come in and grow and start to repair the soil naturally. The other thing, the hardest thing about it is to have patience. So Mother Nature works at her own pace, and a lot of times we get impatient, and so we want everything to be done like in a year or in a season. It takes time. It takes time for those fungal networks to grow and to connect and make all those connections between the plants. It's going to take you several years. So just don't get discouraged. But what if you don't have patience? What can you do if you have no patience? I would say if you don't have patience, there's things you can do to speed the process along. The one thing that I would say, that I would really say you shouldn't do, is to add any type of inorganic fertilizers. So what inorganic fertilizers do is they basically make plants lazy and antisocial. So if you take a young plant, a young seedling, and you put it in even if you put it in healthy, rich soil that's got a lot of fungi and bacteria, if you just feed it inorganic nitrogen, if you just give it all of that stuff that it needs, it's not going to go out and establish those connections and those relationships with the mycorrhizal fungi. It's going to say, you know what, I don't need these. I've got a human partner that's doing everything for me. And so not only are you going to lose the ability for those mycorrhizae to go out and scavenge nutrients, but you think about all those hyphae that go out of the soil that can cover, 1 million times the amount of surface area as the plant's roots. When you get to summer and you look at that plant, if you're not just watering it, it's going to have a lot of trouble getting enough water to supply its needs. And so what we do is when we add inorganic fertilizer, we're making these plants lazy, and then they don't establish those relationships. And then when they need them the most, they don't have them. They just have us. So then it's our job to keep them alive. So maybe you like keeping, going out and like watering plants every day and adding more fertilizer to them every day to keep them going. But I'm kind of lazy, so I'm gonna let the fungi do that. So that's what not to add. When you are adding things, there are things you can add. I would say you want to feed the soil and not the plant. So you want to add things if it's a source of nitrogen, you want it to be a more complex molecules that are not going to be broken down by the plant as easily. That plant's going to have bacteria or fungi kind of break it down for them first, and then they can utilize it. So fungal foods, things that will add are things like hydrolyzed fish, liquid fish, or liquid seaweed or kelp. Those are good fungal foods. They do have, quite a bit of nitrogen in them and other minerals that plants need, but they're in a form it's harder to break down. So the fungi have to break those down for us. Bacteria like sugar. And so if you're trying to increase bacterial diversity in soil, you can add something like molasses, which is a sugar. I will say that most of the time, if you've got a soil that's not very healthy, it's probably not that it doesn't have enough bacteria. It maybe just doesn't have a diversity of bacteria. And so when I'm trying to add kind of liquid foods that will help improve the soil, I'll focus on the fungal foods and then I'll maybe add a little bit of molasses or something for the bacteria. You can add beneficial microbes themselves. Some people sell these, call it bugs in a bottle, these proprietary blends of mycorrhizal fungi and different soil bacteria. I don't know what the shelf life is on those things. I'm trying to imagine like a bottle that's been sitting at the nursery for 3 years, and how much of that stuff is still alive when I pour it on. I don't know, maybe. So that's one option, but compost is another really good option. If you've got a really good compost and you're trying to stretch it and use it over a larger area, one thing you can do is you can make compost tea. It's basically a 5-gallon bucket and a fish tank pump with a bubbler and some cheesecloth, and you put some good, rich, life-giving compost into that little bag. You hang it over the side, and you bubble it for about 1 to 2 days. You don't really want to go longer than that because you don't want it to go anoxic and start to produce like anoxic bacteria. But then you also add in, whenever you put the compost in, you add in some of these kind of liquid foods for the soil and for the fungi and bacteria. And what will happen is, as the agitation from the bubbles comes in here, those bacteria and fungi will go out into the liquid. They'll eat all that food. They'll reproduce, make thousands and thousands more, and then you can take that and apply it out on your soil. So that's one way to kind of make the most of the compost you have, especially if you don't have a huge amount of it. Some people do this, they call it Korean natural farming. They go out into like healthy forest soils and they use like mice in a bag to like lure in and capture soil microbes and fungi from the soil in the forest. And they bring those back and culture them and grow more of them and then apply those. That seems a little complicated for me. But if you got a lot of time and you're really ambitious, that's something that can be pretty promising. And also biochar is another kind of emerging area that some people say it's like, the greatest thing since sliced bread. Some people say it's voodoo, but what biochar basically is it's charcoal, and you can make charcoal out of any kind of plant material, basically. And when you turn plant into charcoal, you're left with basically like the structure of the plant, all the cells are still there, all the cell walls and all the little tubes and vessels are still there. But it's mostly just carbon. And all those little tiny pores and spaces will hold lots and lots of water. And they also have can have a negative charge. And so they'll also grab onto cations, things like calcium and magnesium, all those minerals that the cations that the plants need. And so if you get biochar, it's basically charcoal that has been put somewhere where it can be colonized by fungi and bacteria and all these microorganisms to become biochar. So you take charcoal, basically put it into your compost pile, let it kind of charge and be colonized by all those things, and then put it out into your soil. And it'll be a good source of both water holding infiltration capacity, and also provides kind of structure and places for those soil organisms to live. Now, if you just put plain charcoal out, because it likes to grab on it and hold on to those cations, it'll actually pull a lot of those cations out of your soil, and it'll kind of deplete your soil, at least temporarily, for a little while. So don't go telling people, Andy told me to go put charcoal out there, it's going to make it all better. You want to make sure that you've actually charged it. You can actually even just, like, when you make your charcoal, go ahead and just add kind of your fungal or bacterial foods to it, and then put it in your compost, and it'll get colonized even faster. And then the other thing is you want to choose drought resilient plants. So we want to choose plants that are adapted to live here because they have lived here and they've made it through all of the droughts that we've had. Pick plants that are native to your region. A lot of the native plants, when you go to a store and they sell native plants, it's like, if it's native to Texas or somewhere near Texas, that's kind of good enough most of the time. But there's so many plants that grow right here in your own backyard, right here in Comal County, that we don't utilize those plants. And there's just so much diversity of them. And so I would advocate for trying to, if you're increasing plant diversity, try to increase it by using plants that are native to this area. Another thing to think about is that ornamental plants, they're selected to be ornamental. And in doing that, there's trade-offs between, a plant that maybe is going to put all of its energy and all of its water use into producing flowers all year long, versus a plant that, like, when things get really dry, is able to say, you know what, I'm going to hold on to this moisture because I don't know when it's going to rain again. And even when we have like ornamental varieties of native plants, they've still been designed to kind of have some of those trade-offs. They're maybe designed to flower all year long, but they're going to show a little bit more care than if you're using local seed from plants that grow in this area. And diversity is key. So when I'm trying to think about diversity of a planting, I kind of put plants into kind of functional groups based on the biome. So we're in kind of a grassland biome. The three plant families that are kind of have the most diversity of species here are the sunflower family, the legume family, and the grasses. And so I want to make sure that whatever I'm planting, I've got lots of sunflowers, or things in the sunflower, aster, daisy family, lots of legumes, and perennial legumes, not just bluebonnets, but legumes that are perennial, that live year after year. Grasses, this kind of gangy looking grass growing in my little prairie garden is Canada wild rye. It's really easy to establish cool season grass. These kind of big wheat looking seed heads. And then kind of everything else is going to be all of your other families of plants. And so I try to, when I think about diversity, I try to kind of think of those functional groups. And then, like I said, I'm kind of lazy. You can spend a lot of time and effort trying to improve your soil and put all these additives in. But at the end of the day, if you're planting diverse groups of plants, the plants themselves are going to improve the soil. They're going to do a lot of the work for you. So let us step back and let them do that. Here's kind of this is definitely not an inclusive list, but this is all the plants that I could fit on a page without making the print so small that I was worried that people would be able to read it. But these are easy plants to grow from seed. So if you're going to go out and collect seed, you got an area that's in really bad shape and degraded, and you just want to kind of like jumpstart it. This is kind of what I'm talking about kind of the amount of diversity that you want to have. So we've got grasses here on this side. These are, got some cool season grasses like our winter grass and little barley and wild rye. I got my warm season grasses, still like some of our grandma grasses, Texas cup grass is really great. Tall drop seed, if you've never grown tall drop seed, that's a really wonderful, fast growing, kind of short to mid grass that does really well here. And then I've got my 3-ons, which are they're kind of in between cool season and warm season. So they're doing their thing in that time of year when the cool season grasses are finishing up, the warm season grasses are just getting started. Over on the other side, we've got legumes. So here's a couple of annual legumes. Three annual legumes here. The blue one, it's deer pea, vetch, and partridge pea. And then prostrate bundle flower is kind of a real weedy, low-growing, prostrate little perennial legume. We've got our sunflowers and asters. There's tons of these that are kind of weedy natives that will grow really well from seed. And you're probably familiar with most of them, but maybe not all of them. But these are all ones that grow really well right here in Central Texas, and ones that have done really well in my little prairie strip that I'm kind of working on the side of my house. And then others, horsemint is a really good, horsemint will grow on the moon, I think, if there was enough oxygen for it. And it blooms in the middle of the summer whenever everything else is kind of like struggling. So that's a good one. Prairie parsley is a really nice biannual thing from the carrot family. It's a host plant for the black swallowtails, really like it, but all of the butterflies really like the flowers when they bloom in May. And then the prairie verbena and yellow flax. Those are all ones that I've had a lot of success with, just putting them out in areas that are really degraded and not well, and they come up from seed and do really well. There's also one area that people really struggle with in this part of the country is like what to do with dry shade. And I've done some talks on like plants for dry shade, but this is kind of a short list of plants that do really well here in dry shade. And so we've got grasses and sedges. The sedges do particularly well in shady areas where there's not a lot of grasses that do well. And all of these sedges here are fairly drought tolerant. So we've got eastern woodland sedge, Cherokee sedge, and Weatherville sedge. All three of those will do well in upland areas where if you just have a little bit of mulch in there, once they're established, they're pretty drought hardy in the shade. Texas fescue is kind of a hidden gem of a plant that most folks don't know about, but it grows right here in Comal County. It's actually kind of a rare plant, but in Comal County, there's places where it's fairly abundant locally. It likes to grow kind of under oak trees out of the edge where it's kind of in shade part of the day, but in the shade part of the day. And it's a cool season grass that has these nice kind of wispy seed heads. I've got a bunch coming up in my little shade garden in my front right now, and it's a plant that I'm trying to kind of propagate and get out there more for people because it's a really great one that nobody really grows. And then another one, rusty seed paspalum. If you haven't heard of rusty seed paspalum, that's a great no maintenance warm season grass. So as the cool season grasses and sedges are kind of starting to wind down in the summer, the rusty seed paspalum pops up and is green and does great all summer. You can mow it and keep it kind of short and it'll still be fine, or you can let it bunch out and it'll be about 12, 15 inches high. And the seed heads are not really ornamental, but the grass itself looks really nice, and it's a good kind of filler grass for shady or part shade areas that's super drought tolerant. Some herbaceous things on here. Everybody knows about Turk's cap. Everybody loves Turk's cap. You guys, anybody here have marble seed? Yeah, marble seed is a really easy to grow, maybe too easy to grow because it does like to spread itself around.
But in most places, that's a good thing. And it's coming up. It's starting to flower this week in my yard, and it has these kind of pendant white flowers that hang down, and the bumblebees seem to love it. So the bumblebees will come and they'll grab onto it and hang from it, and then kind of stick their tongue up there and get a drink. It's a great bumblebee plant. And Drummond's wild petunia is another good one that grows in kind of the same type of habitats as the Turk's cap and the marble seed. That's also really easy to get established and will continue to spread itself around by seed over time. But this is one that starts blooming at my house usually around end of May, beginning of June, as everything else is kind of, giving in to summer. This thing is like perking up and starting to bloom, and it'll bloom all through the summer, all the way into the winter until we get a frost. And so it's a really tough, as long as it's in a little bit of shade, it'll do. I bloomed all through the drought last year. It did fine. So in conclusion, if we have healthy soils, we're going to have drought resilience. And so that's a lot of the drought resilience that we've lost has been because we've degraded our soils. And so the flip side of that is if we improve our soils, we'll improve our drought resilience. And then let nature do most of the work. Like I said, we're so fixated on having to do everything ourselves. A lot of times, all we have to do is kind of step back, get out of the way, and quit doing things that are making the problem worse. And nature will repair itself. Use native plants from your area, and then biodiversity is going to be a key. So make sure that you have a diverse mix of native plants. If you want to look further into like soil health and some of the stuff that has really gotten me excited, this is a list of, this is not all-inclusive list, but these are some of the books that I've been reading the last few years that have really sent me down some rabbit holes that were really interesting. I've got a couple of them with me here tonight. So I've got a Soil Owner's Manual. This is like a really great, it's a really thin thing, but it's very, very concise and very well done. And it's a good mix of like really in-depth scientific concepts about soil and soil health and fungi, all that stuff. But it's in pretty layman's terms. It's pretty easy to understand. And it's a really good one. I think anybody that owns soil should own the Soil Owner's Manual. And then the other one is by a guy who has orchards, and he's not a soil scientist or a mycologist like a fungal scientist, but he just really got into mycorrhizal fungi, and like just has all of his success with his orchards have been because he's really figured out how fungi work. And so this book it's called Mycorrhizal Planet. It goes really in depth into a lot more than what I talked about in terms of all these weird, crazy things that mycorrhizal fungi do. Their evolutionary histories, but he has a lot of just kind of like strategies for improving fungal diversity in your soil in different for different types of crops or different types of trees. And so it's a really interesting one. I'll have these out if you guys want to kind of thumb through them and look at them when we're done. Feel free to do that. Otherwise, I'll take any other questions you guys have. Yes.
I was thinking about getting rid of my mulch, my flower bed, and doing decomposed granite.
Mhm.
Would there be an advantage or disadvantage to doing
I would say the mulch is going to be more beneficial because over time it's going to break down and it's going to provide food for fungi, whereas the granite might provide some of that. It might provide some cover. So like the mulch provides cover to keep the rain from washing the soil away, and it might help with the soil moisture some. But I think that the mulch is probably going to do a better job long term with that.
I've got an area where the Texas thistle just took over last year. Will that eventually, will other things move in? Because they died when the soil was bare.
Yeah. So when you have these plants, a lot of the like things we consider like invasive plants, even things like bastard cabbage, they're doing the same thing the bluebonnets are doing. They're coming in and they're a band-aid to cover those bare soils and start that process back over.
If you leave them eventually, it may take years and years. You don't take any other action for that to start to improve. But over time, as you start to improve the soil and get more plant material back into it, you'll have other plants that will move in. And what you'll tend to see is once you get the soil healthier and healthier and more diverse and have more fungal diversity, a lot of those colonizer species will kind of just disappear and they'll quit germinating in those soils. They're really adapted to pop up and grow in those kind of bacterially dominated soils.
So things you've been talking about tonight, these things that textiles applies to roadsides and things. I know they have a big budget concern with mowing stuff,
Yeah, I would like to think that these are all things that the TxDOT and other agencies will learn to apply over time. I think they do some things better than others in terms of reducing chemical usage and all of that. But I think there's still a way to go on that. Yeah.
So so we have soil that's not letting water come in. You've got your microbiome or other fungi and et cetera,
Mhm.
doing their thing underground, but you still need water going into ground. I've gotten my husband away from burning up the water, but I use a pitchfork and just, put hole slightly, move it. Is that, it's probably still messing up the fungi, but is it, I'm assuming it's also better.
Yeah, people, and if you read like some of the folks that are like in the regenerative agriculture, if you have a really, really compacted soil that's compacted very deeply, they'll use something like a broad fork where they go in and it kind of like, it has times that you poke in and kind of loosen it a little bit, but you're trying to create a little bit of extra infiltration in the soil that doesn't infiltrate at all. That's different than turning it all completely over. And so a little bit of that, especially in the beginning when you're starting with a really compacted soil, might be beneficial.
What is your role at TxDOT? What do you do?
I'm a biologist, and so I work on a lot of like endangered species, kind of come up with ways to avoid and minimize impacts of projects on endangered species or other natural resources.
Another question on when you say biodiversity, and I've done some whatever on bees, and they like you to have the same plants together for bees because the bees only get the pollen off one plant at a time. It's like they don't mix them, they go back home and then they come here. So is every planter, I mean, is couple feet okay, or how interspersed do they have to be at?
Yeah, most bees will forage over an area, even small bees will forage over an area of, a few hundred feet. And the larger the bee, kind of the bigger its foraging radius would be. And they may even go up to like, half a mile. And so if you're doing plantings in an area and you're kind of trying to create a focused area for pollinators, however you space the plants in there, they'll be close enough for them to come in and kind of move from one to another. But a lot of bees there are a lot of bees that only use plants in the sunflower family, but they're not particularly picky about which species. And so if you've got different species of plant, like sunflower plants, and daisies and asters growing at different times of year, then those bees will be around all year long versus if you just had one type of plant that only blooms for 2 or 3 months.
There's a question on the chat. Their preferred legumes, compact soil.
Preferred legumes for compacted soils. So legumes don't tend to have like really deep, like powerful roots to kind of drill down into those. They tend to have kind of shallower roots that are kind of more branchy, and in that kind of the top of the soil. So what I would say is I would plant legumes in association with something that's going to have a deeper taproot that will kind of help break that up. Some of the things that are really good for breaking up those compacted soils are things like in the mustard family and in the carrot family, because they produce these like deep taproots that kind of poke down and drill through those hard compacted layers. You can even, when you're starting out, just go in and plant things like radishes and carrots and turnips in those areas to begin with as like a cover crop. They'll go down and poke those holes in and drill down into the soil. And then if you just leave them there to decompose, those roots are providing organic matter, and then they're providing little channels for water to flow down and to get further into the soil. So that's a strategy as well. All right. Well, like I said, I'll hang around for a few minutes, and you guys can thumb through these books if you want, or ask any more questions or chat. But I appreciate you having me come out and talk tonight.